want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hi, folks, and welcome back to The Enemies List. I am your host, Rick Wilson. Thank you all for joining us once again as we talk to the most interesting people in America. Today, my guest is Andrew McCabe. He's the former deputy director of the FBI from the fairly quiet, slow years of 2016 to 2018, when nothing much was really happening in Washington. And now, Andrew, I wanted you on the show because I noticed the other day that Donald Trump, his allies, at least like Steve Bannon, had started to be more explicit about their threats, and they're threatening a lot of people that they have been who have offended them in the past in some way. You and I are both on a very exclusive, well, actually, maybe it's not that exclusive list of people that they want to send to Gitmo. So I wanted to reach out today and have a conversation with you about all these promises of revenge that Donald Trump is making. And about how we should think about them, not only for people like you and me who are sort of in the spotlight of Trump and his allies, but also for ordinary Americans about the world they'll be living in if that's the kind of place that we become.
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction. And I think I've been speaking about this a little bit more, partially just because people are asking me about it more. I think more people are thinking about it, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
There are so many levels to this. There's the, just, I was going to say irony, really hypocrisy is probably a better way to describe the caterwauling from Trump and his supporters about the alleged weaponization of the Department of Justice against him in these many different cases, many of which the Department of Justice has nothing to do with. And then at the same time, they just outright overt pledge to weaponize the Department of Justice against, presumably the half the country if he's reelected. So, but it goes a lot deeper than that. And I think that, just to be clear, this is not about, I'm really not interested at all in anybody's sympathy. I'm sure you're not.
No.
Or anyone similarly situated. I'll be fine. Like, I have gone through this already. And I'm not worried about me, but I think that people don't understand the fundamental change that this country is in for if Donald Trump is reelected. And if he simply follows through on the things he's already said he's going to do. So this isn't an exercise in political thought experiments and philosophical debates. This is just simply listen to what the man says and what he says he's going to do. And we will become a place where government no longer functions on any level if people in government are terrified to make hard decisions, to hold people accountable to the same rules and the same laws, if they are simply living in fear of some sort of expected retribution. And you don't even really have to do that very often. All you have to do is put out the threat of it. You have to replace some leaders across, powerful and high-profile positions across government agencies, which he's already sworn he would do. Replace those people with sycophants and parasites who will do nothing but, please the dear leader. And that's it. The message goes out. It's done at that point. People in subordinate leadership positions and mid-level management positions are going to be too afraid to do the right thing, whatever the right thing is in their jobs. And I think that's really frightening.
That's really something that led you into the position that you found yourself, because the FBI, when the revelations about Trump's various connections to Russia back during the 2016 campaign came, the FBI did the right thing. They wouldn't let it just drop, or wouldn't let it disappear, wouldn't follow the guidance that Trump was trying to give them in his very unsubtle way of end all this and I'll be nice to you.
Exactly.
So you found yourself as one of the people that he identified as as somebody that was, stubborn about doing the following the rules and the law and the intent of what DOJ is, because as you point out, the long tradition of the Justice Department has been to try to very carefully walk a line to stay out of the political and stick with the law and the procedural. This weekend he was floating Kash Patel as an acting attorney general. I mean, explain to folks that how the DOJ really works as opposed to this lurid fantasy version that's out there on Fox News and elsewhere. Yeah,
I mean, bad enough. Kash Patel's name gets thrown around like every open job, and they're all horrible. They're all disgusting ideas of wildly mismatched in terms of responsibility and knowledge and experience necessary to do those things, and Kash Patel on the other side of that. So whatever. But I think, and particularly people don't understand the interplay between the FBI and DOJ. And the FBI is a part of DOJ. We are a component part, but a very independent one that hates to think of ourselves as a part of DOJ. But nevertheless, they work very closely together. Politics does not involve or influence the work that the FBI does in any way, period, full stop. There's one political appointee in the FBI, and that is the director. Everyone else are career professionals. The vast majority of FBI people stay in the FBI for the entirety of their careers. It's an institution with almost no people don't walk away. Right? It's
interesting.
Yeah,
I actually did not know that. That is that really tells you something about the culture as it should exist in an organization like that.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
It's a gift, but it can also be a bit of a curse when you have to change things at the FBI. It's very hard to do that because the culture is so strong and people have been there so long. But nevertheless, it's an incredible level of devotion to duty and loyalty, which is what makes the Bureau so great. DOJ is a little bit different, right? Sure. There's more political people at DOJ in leadership positions, but there are still literally hundreds of thousands of career folks who do the day-to-day work of the Department of Justice. And at the end of the day, people don't get prosecuted by DOJ or the FBI. They get indicted by their fellow citizens. If DOJ can run an investigation, they bring the results of that investigation in front of a grand jury, and 23 of your fellow citizens decide whether or not there's probable cause to believe you committed a crime. If they make that decision, you get indicted. Is it a low bar? Yeah, often it is. Most cases that get presented get indicted.
Ham sandwich, right?
Yeah, so giving rise to that theory. But DOJ doesn't bring cases that they don't think will get indicted either. So it's not just a random cross-section of criminality.
I think that's one thing that people very much on the right have missed, is that conspiracies like the one they believe is being run against Donald Trump don't exist. They literally cannot function in organizations like the DOJ and the FBI. There are too many layers, too many fire breaks, too many IG functions, all these things. They literally cannot occur in the way they think they occur, because, and I always find this ironic, they think that Joe Biden, either A, he's a senile old man drooling on his own shirt, or B, he's secretly pulling Merrick Garland's puppet strings all day long. And I think that the case in point here is that Joe Biden did do the right things when it came to his own son's the special prosecutor, and the first conviction on Hunter. He has said, I'm not touching this. I'm not in this. I'm not doing this. I have nothing to do with this. I mean, have we lost the thread in America in some weird way that it's surprising when a president does the right thing in that way?
I think it's yes. The answer is yes. I think a lot of people have, and I think it's because so many people are so obsessed with finding the information behind the information, the man behind the curtain, the conspiracy theory. They run to that. They run to the suggestion of that and ignore the facts.
Right.
So the Joe Biden myth, I try to tell this to people all the time in my commentary on CNN. Like, just think about it like an investigator. What proof do we have? At the end of the day, do you think Joe would like the case against Trump to go forward or would not like it? None of that matters. What evidence do we have that Joe Biden said or did anything to influence those two federal cases? And the answer is there isn't any. There's none. So
Right.
it's
Zero.
it's irresponsible and moronic to embrace this idea that Joe Biden is orchestrating these cases against his political rival. It's just not happening, but yet half the country believes it.
It is remarkable. So, Andrew, take us back a little bit, because something I've been realizing recently, and I realized it during the New York case and the trial, Americans have a shorter memory than I think. And they have forgotten by the time we got to Stormy Daniels, people were like, wait, didn't I hear something about her like 10 years ago? Remind people of why Trump's vendetta against the DOJ, the FBI, and you and others there. Remind people how we got here in that particular lane.
Yeah, boy, you're really putting me back in the time machine here today, Rick. I'll never escape it. So, I could just speak to our experience investigating what we thought was the possibility that the government of Russia and its intelligence services tried to meddle in the 2016 election. And we had a number of reasons to believe that. We flat out knew, we had very solid intelligence that their intel services were behind a lot of very aggressive cyber attacks on our political system. We knew that had been going on for over a year. We then saw them steal information from the DNC and then use that information right on the eve of the convention. So it was not just the standard cyber theft that we've been seeing for a long time, but it was actually the weaponization of that material that made it different. And then, of course, in the wake of that weaponization, we get notified by a friendly foreign government that they had been talking to someone in the campaign months earlier who said that essentially that the Russians had offered to do what they had gone ahead and done, which was dump a bunch of information about Hillary Clinton into the political biosphere. So at that point, there's ample investigation. Even the DOJ IG, who I wouldn't agree with probably on anything but this, agreed with our conclusion that there was plenty of information to start an investigation. So that's how it all started for us, the investigation widely now known as Crossfire Hurricane. And then, of course, Trump put himself in the middle of those crosshairs by his own activity, by his own statements, his repeated interactions with Jim Comey, his repeated requests that we drop the case or at least tell the general public that he was not under investigation, which is not something that the FBI does.
Right.
And of course, at the end of that series, he fired Jim Comey and he wrote a letter himself, basically blaming the firing on, a lot of things having to do with the Russia investigation. So then we confronted the very real prospect that Trump may have known about Russia's efforts, maybe was part of some sort of conspiracy to involve their help, to get their help, and possibly fired the director of the FBI in an effort to obstruct our investigation.
Right.
So that's how Trump himself ended up as a subject of investigation after my decision to add him as such. Right.
And people forget, I come out in as I like to say, in the very before times. I was in the defense world, and people forget or underestimate or underscore the degree to which Russia, they may be a second world military, a third world economy, but they have a first-rate intelligence service and a first-rate propaganda service. And they really did see Donald Trump as their pony in that race. They really did take a lot of resources and throw them at the Internet Research Agency and other Russian, I almost say Soviet every time because I'm old.
I'm right there with you.
But they really did throw a lot of resources into this. And so you guys at the FBI were looking like, what are the connections here? What is the through line from Prigozhin, R.I.P. not, to people like Paul Manafort, people like Mike Flynn, people like George Papadopoulos, people all on this broad list of folks that you guys were exploring, were connected to this. This wasn't some made up Hillary Clinton inspired rabbit hunt. This was a real case.
It was a very real case, and it was based on very real, very dangerous activity from the Russians that we had observed. And then, of course, the reporting from the foreign government about George Papadopoulos. He's the person who made those comments. So at that point, we have the case open. You have to focus a case on some people. That's what we do. We investigate people's potentially illegal or national security concerning behaviors. So George Papadopoulos ends up as one of the first targets. And then we start thinking about who else might have been a connection, a conduit to the Russians who we know is involved in the campaign. Mike Flynn came to mind because of his somewhat bizarre behavior, attending events in Russia, sitting next to Putin, that sort of thing. Paul Manafort, for very obvious reasons, who had conducted all sorts of other political skullduggery for the Russians in Ukraine. And finally, Carter Page. Carter Page was already a subject of a counterintelligence investigation in New York for dealing with known Russian intelligence officers. So there were 4 very logical avenues to start on. That was the beginning. And, I think in the crazy kind of nonsense and the now very, very common criticisms of the Christopher Steele information and the mistakes that we were guilty of in the Carter Page FISA.
Right.
All that has kind of overshadowed the substance of the investigation itself and the things we were concerned about. But, I don't stay awake at night worrying about that. People think what they want. That's fine. But
no investigation is perfect, and everybody's human in these processes. And so,
for sure.
I mean, it's interesting to me that you now have a lot of Republicans who want to burn FISA down and get rid of the FISA court, for never have it again, even though the broad history of the FISA process has been to actually protect the rights of Americans who are under investigation, not as some sort of weaponized tool to get Trump or anything else like that.
Absolutely. This is the massive reformation, really, of our intelligence, domestic and foreign intelligence activities in the wake of Hoover and the Church Committee hearings and everything else. And so certainly FISA was a massive development in protecting Americans' rights and protecting them against the activities of intelligence collection in the United States. But ultimately, we learned after 9/11 that we had too many not legal restrictions on FISA, but institutional restrictions on the way that we worked with FISA information that made us vulnerable to a plot like 9/11. Had we not been tying our own hands behind our own backs, we may have been better at picking out the activities of the 9/11 hijackers. So FISA was expanded and we were given new authorities that I think are in the right balance now. Maybe a little bit overboard then. Kind of makes sense in the wake of 9/11. Everything was gung-ho. We got to find these guys. And I was definitely a part of that team. But
every one of us was gung-ho at that moment about
so
finding those guys.
Things have calibrated a bit. But like the recent effort to reauthorize Section 702, which I'm not going to bore all your listeners with the legalities of that. But, oh, my God, what an important tool to keep Americans safe, to know what terrorists and foreign spies and cyber creeps in other parts of the world are saying and who they may be contacting here in the United States is just incredibly important to protecting our safety.
It is. Again, I think that's one of the more dangerous aspects institutionally of Trump's sort of revenge plot, which is I'm going to stock the DOJ with all my people. They're going to do exactly what I want them to do. I'm going to weaponize this process I imagine was weaponized against me to harm my political enemies. But this is kind of a machine. You don't get to take it apart and put it back together and have it still function the right way. It's like a gorilla taking apart a grandfather clock. It doesn't work if you try to do the way they're doing it. I think they could put this country at really meaningful risk if they do the things like unwind FISA, if they do the things like eventually breaking 702, if they do the things like stopping any investigation that Donald Trump puts his thumb on the scale on. You could end up, because like no other president in modern history, Donald Trump has a enormous web of contacts with foreign governments, from his family, his businesses, his allies, that and some of those foreign governments are not friendly to us. They are not, as he would say, very fine people. No, they're not. And, look, this is a guy who today,
today is in front of the Supreme Court arguing that he should have absolute immunity from any sort of criminal repercussions from anything he either does while president or did while he was president. So that effort inexorably takes you down a path where you now have a system of justice that is not the same. You have carved out a political class, a ruling class that will be subjected to different standards, different laws, and different levels of accountability than every other American. And if you think that that's the right way that we should be approaching the concept of justice in this country, you should move somewhere else, because that's not what we built this place about.
Yeah, the word for what the word Trumpers would be a nomenclatura, which is the Russian word for the elites who are above the law, except for Vladimir Putin's friend.
Exactly.
You know,
in Russia, you join the Duma because you get criminal immunity by doing so.
Right. I mean, this is not a world that Americans should want to live in. You know, it's interesting. You wrote a book in 2019 called The Threat, and it was called Protecting America in the Age of Terror and Trump. And I still think that in 2019, there was a sort of belief that the terror part of this was still an extant thing on our horizon. Since you wrote that, I will say this. I mean, I've been a critic of Trump since the beginning, since 2015. My degree of concern about what he will do in a second term if he's reelected, it was a 4-5, and now it's a 9-10. I think he presents a risk to this country's future in a second term that that probably outweighs almost every terrorist group out there in the world right now, who by all means do not like us and would love to see us harmed. But I think Trump could do more damage in a shorter time than nation states and certainly sub-nation state terror groups could.
Yeah, I mean, they're very different dangers, but the danger from terrorism, whether it's domestic or international, is to stay in front of that threat and to mitigate risk and eliminate threats before they hurt people.
Right.
And even when we get caught by surprise and let our guard down or looking in the wrong direction and we get hit, we'll get up off that mat and we'll respond appropriately. What you're talking about from a second Trump administration is a threat that's entirely different. It's a threat to our the corpus of our democracy. If we allow this sort of institutional rot to take place over the course of 4 years or however long that lasts, that's a degradation that could take us generations to recover from.
Exactly.
It's a fundamental restructuring of the way Americans see their role as decision makers and vote makers in a democratic society. And I think we're thinking about things that we've never had to consider before in our political process. But I think that Americans should be thinking this way. Hey, look, everybody'd like the Snickers bar to be cheaper and the gallon of gas to be cheaper and the interest rates to be coming down and all that stuff. And I agree with all that. We can have all kinds of principled discussions about what policy is better for those.
I'd love to have those fights.
How nice would that be? Right. But this is a fundamentally different conversation we have to have now. It's like, what do you think this country should look like next year, 10 years from now, 50 years from now? Because that's the moment that we are currently in.
So you started your career on the organized crime side, looking into organized crime operations. There are a lot of people now who have, they've analogized Trump to a mob boss, to an OC leader. Is that too broad? Because I think now that he's actually a convicted felon and is probably going to end up, if we go forward with any of these cases, scoring a few more convictions. I'm just wondering, is the Trump as crime boss analogy too strong? I mean, they're paying off their witnesses, giving them jobs and bonuses and whatnot of witnesses in cases against him. They're engaging in lawfare across the board, I think. They're trying to intimidate folks. It just strikes me that a lot of this stuff, it's so mob-tastic. It's so, it's so crude that I want to use the analogy more. And sometimes I'm like, no, that's not really him, but it almost seems like it is.
A lot of it fits, but at the same time, I worry that it's a little bit overly simplistic.
Okay.
And he shares some of the same attributes, like the way he speaks in code, the way he refuses to write anything down, the way he values one-way loyalty above everything else.
Right.
And, surrounds himself with people, not who he thinks are good or smart or capable, but people who will just do his bidding without any sort of resistance. So those are all similarities. On the other hand, he's also incredibly reckless. He routinely says things that are very harmful to his own causes, be they legal or political or otherwise. Now he manages to get away with it too, so maybe there's a crazy brilliance behind that. But there are a lot of kind of organized crime tactics and approaches to problems that you can see easily that he shares with some of the more infamous organized crime bosses that we're all familiar with. But he really does take it to a new level. I think he's really mastered the art of kind of stumbling in plain sight. And if he does that over and over and over again, eventually it all just blurs together. It's more like the old Soviet propaganda approach, right? Just flood the zone with contradictory information, and eventually people just get disgusted and
exhausted.
Exactly. Check out, right? And I think Trump benefits from that as well. It just fire hose of lies and things that are provably false, and eventually none of it matters.
I have a bizarre, and it's too long a story for this call, but I have a bizarre like family mob connection from Tampa stuff back in the 60s and 70s. Santo Trafficante never said anything to anybody.
Yeah,
that's why he stayed out of jail. He was incredibly disciplined about that stuff. He tried to, it was always somebody talked to somebody's cousin who talked to his friend, and maybe they think that's what Santo wanted to do. And that lesson is one, I think that's the one thing that we have on Trump in a weird way. That's one of his greatest vulnerabilities, is that he has no personal discipline. And that's why all these threats that he's making to everybody out who's ever opposed him politically or in the courts or in the DOJ or in the FBI, like you guys, I think that's why these threats are kind of sloppy. I would be more intimidated if Bannon wasn't out talking trash. I'd be more worried if Trump wasn't out talking about putting us all in jail, because I think that it betrays his disorganized thinking and the sort of recklessness of his character in a way that makes him a little easier to beat, and maybe gives us a little more lead time if he does come at us.
Hope so. I mean, I think you're onto something there. I think he also he's also really bad at turning on people who he really needs to keep. He should want to keep within his circle.
Oh, yeah.
And Michael Cohen's the perfect example.
Sure.
Every once in a while, you'll get an Alan Weisselberg who won't say anything cross about the guy, no matter what he's put through. But not everyone is like that. And look, I know from past history, like that's how the FBI makes cases. We always find that person. And, it's just, he leaves a wake of bodies behind him, and some of them aren't dead yet, and they're ready to stand up and defend themselves or try to take something back, whatever it is. And that's very sloppy for a crime boss.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew McCabe, I am so grateful you came on the show today. What a great conversation. I really appreciate you, your service, and your insights today. Folks, you can catch Andrew on CNN frequently. And Andrew, where else can people reach you on the socials?
So I'm a big denier of social media. So I'm not on any of them.
Good for you. God bless you.
I do have a podcast called Jack, comes out every week about the special counsel investigation. So
there's exactly the last thing I wanted to do was mention your podcast called Jack.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
Well, Andrew, thank you again so much for coming on the Enemies List today. What a great show. I really appreciate you. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Rick. It's been a pleasure.